Yeah, some of the seamounts at the bottom of the ocean are much larger than Mount Everest. I mean, they're just huge mountains, and some of the valleys, the deep trenches, much larger than the Grand Canyon. These are distributed all around the ocean. We're in an area now around Hawaii. Hawaii itself is one of these seamounts. Hawaii starts at 7,000 meters, so 28, 30,000 feet below, and then comes up the Big Island much higher than Mount Everest. That's 40, 50,000 feet by the time you get from the seafloor to what the top is. Now Hawaii happens to be one that's sticking up above the sea surface. Hawaii is a relatively young island. It's hot because of magma, and there's still volcanoes going off on the Big Island. But as they get older, they cool down and they sink. And so beyond what we see as the Hawaiian island chain, there are many more islands, seamounts, that used to be surface islands, but are now submerged below. There's a chain of islands goes all the way. We call it the Emperor Seamount chain. Turns around, goes right to Japan, to Hawaii. The whole chain of these submerged seamounts. And in the Pacific, there are tens of thousands of these seamounts.
Hey, Larry, so where are you now?
I'm on the exploration vessel Nautilus, which is a vessel run by the Ocean Exploration Trust, Bob Ballard's trust, and we're sitting off Hawaii.
Larry, that's a very dark room for being out in Hawaii right now.
Yeah, well, we're in. This is the kind of the myth of being at sea is, we sit in these control vans, don't often really see the water, except this ship has so much video that we can see it from the cameras. But for this evolution, I'll have to go out on the deck and actually get sunburnt and help launch the vehicle. And then we have to recover it too.
Where are you at? Where are you going?
Well, we're sitting off. We're just a little south of Lanai, the island of Lanai, and we're going to do a little mapping mission. So the vehicle is equipped with a very fancy mapping system, a sonar system to map the seafloor. And so we're gonna spend about 3-4 hours mapping, and then after that, we're gonna leave the vehicle in the water and we're gonna move someplace else. This vehicle is remarkable because it can travel faster actually than the big ship, so it can go 14 knots or so. And the big ship and the vehicle, which we call DRIX, is going to move to deeper water. And then we're going to launch another autonomous underwater vehicle. And then we'll have our surface vehicle follow the underwater vehicle around and communicate with each other. So we call this kind of cruise a technology challenge. We're really trying to evolve the technology on this trip rather than focusing fundamentally on science problems.
Now, is it pretty deep out there around Hawaii or no?
Yeah, it gets deep very quick. We're for our mapping, we're going to be in relatively shallow water. So it'll be about 200 meters, about 600, 700 feet. But as soon as we're done with the mapping, we'll move to about 3,000, 4,000 feet of water. And we can easily get much deeper than that very quickly because coming off the islands, it gets deep so quickly around here. That's one of the nice.
So when you take on a mapping problem, which you do all the time, explain to the audience, okay, what is the goal? What area, how much footage or mileage, and why are you doing it, and what are you trying to accomplish with this particular mapping session?
Sure. What we're doing here really is on this trip is developing technology, but this is technology in support of a much larger goal, and that larger goal is really trying to see a complete map of the ocean. Right now, we have less than, well, maybe just about 20% of the seafloor map, and it's horrendous. Can you imagine walking around outside and trying to navigate if you only had 20% of the land mapped? And the ocean is so critical to our existence and as a source of oxygen and a control of heat distribution. And we don't understand the heat distribution because we don't understand the passageways of the deep currents that move that heat. And so to understand those kinds of things, we need to have a complete map of the ocean. And so our mission, in part, and we have many other missions and many other science goals, but part of our mission is to try to see this complete map of the ocean completed, hopefully by 2030. Maybe it'll take a little longer, but that's our aspirational goal is 2030.
Do we know more about Mars than we know about Earth?
We absolutely do. We have very high resolution maps of Mars, the complete planet. We can do with the current technology, we're out here developing new technology that will hopefully make this more efficient and easier to do. But with the current technology, it's just using the big ships like the ship we're on, the Nautilus. It has a deep water mapping system. Those ships are expensive. They cost $50,000, $60,000 a day to operate. But we've estimated that it would take about what we call 200 ship years. I mean, 200 ships in 1 year or one one ship 200 years to do that complete mapping, to map what we have left. And at today's cost, that would cost about $3 to $5 billion. And that's a lot of money. But every one of those Mars missions that has mapped Mars very, very well, it costs about $3 to $5 billion too.
Yeah.
And I love the idea that we've mapped Mars, but I also think we owe it to our own planet, especially since we have such existential problems right now. Don't you think we can take that effort of one of those Mars-like missions and turn it to our own planet and get this complete mapping done? And so that's what we're trying to do on this trip. Though we're trying to see, is there ways that we can do this more efficiently? And so instead of having to use big ships like this, can we send robotic vehicles out that are much less expensive to operate? And so that's what we're developing, this technology for the robotic vehicles.
I think that the part of the challenge here is that people do not understand, and the people that need to understand the existential crisis and why. What helps humanity by mapping the ocean? How is that going to help us directly in many different ways? If you could give us a little taste of that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it's hard sometimes to express, but I think we're recognizing more and more how critical the ocean is in every aspect of our existence. Again, it supplies 50% of the oxygen. It is the moderator of the carbon dioxide that's creating so much problems. The ocean has absorbed a lot of the excess carbon dioxide we've put into it, but it can't keep doing that. And so I look at it from the broadest perspective that if we don't understand the ocean, if we don't understand what I call the context, the geospatial context, how can we predict the weather if we didn't know the Rocky Mountains were there? How could we predict the weather if we didn't know there were deep valleys? It's the same in the ocean with global climate, that we can't predict what the climate will do in the long term unless we understand how heat is distributed. And that's done through deep currents. The roughness of the seafloor, just how rough or smooth it is, has a lot to do with how temperature is distributed in the ocean. And again, without those maps of the seafloor, we can't model that roughness. The climate models really will suffer. And so from that kind of perspective, I think we can make strong arguments that to improve the climate models, we need to have complete maps of the ocean. But it goes beyond that. It goes to the fact that we may be turning to the oceans for sources of nutrition, that how long can our land-based agriculture sustain us? And so we'll be turning more and more to the ocean for that. And we just need to understand that world we have to live in. When we first built the United States and President Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark out to explore, it was for the economic prosperity of the US, and what they were there to basically see what's there, make a map. And so if we don't know what's there, how can we manage? How can we control it? How can we understand it?
When we mapped Mars, we mapped it from orbit. So why do we need to map Earth from the surface of the ocean or deeper?
Yeah, I would love to be able to just send a satellite up and have it map in detail the ocean. We actually have a way from satellites to make a very, very coarse map of the seafloor. We can see where the biggest bumps are and the deepest valleys, because believe it or not, the surface of the ocean is pushed up and down by features even thousands of feet, tens of thousands of feet below, because of the gravitational attraction of a big mountain underneath the ocean will deviate the surface by a few centimeters, and the satellites can actually track that. So we get these very, very rough maps, but they're not useful for the kind of things I was talking about, for really understanding the context and the roughness and where the currents will flow. And the problem is that the wonderful satellite maps that we have, Google Earth, that we see all the time, this beautiful imagery, uses electromagnetic waves, uses light waves, and they just don't travel in water. And so we cannot use the light. The satellite just going over the ocean will show you the surface, and that's it, can't penetrate. And so we have to depend on sound waves, acoustic waves, which travel very well. And so they will only travel if we're coupled with the water. You have to start that sound wave in the water. So we have to be in a ship on the water or in a vehicle under the water to propagate that sound. And so we're constrained in that.
How does that sound affect the animals of the ocean, or do they not notice it? Or...
Yeah, no, that's a really good, a very important question, and a question we've been very concerned about. The best studies about the particularly marine mammals who are most sensitive, who depend on sound for communication, for their feeding and things like that. Those animals operate in a frequency range, and I'll use a number. Doesn't matter if you know what it means, but 200 kilohertz is a number and below. And so some of our echo sounders, some of our profilers that we use for the seafloor are above that. So they're out of the range of hearing, but others are not. Others are in the range of hearing. And there are systems when oil companies go out and explore for oil and gas deposits, they use very loud and very low frequency sound. Instead of a 200 number, they're using numbers like 1 or 2. And that's in the hearing range of marine mammals. And we know that that has impact, and there's lots and lots of efforts to mitigate those impacts and controls on that. The sonars that we use are kind of in the middle there. They're not like the ones the oil company uses. They're in the middle range there. They're in the hearing range when we work in deep water. And we've been studying directly what those impacts are. And so far, and we've just published 3 or 4 papers about this, we've gone to places where we know we have resident populations of very sensitive marine mammals, and they're in areas where they can be tracked because there are Navy sensors on the seafloor that can hear the marine mammals. These are Cuvier-beaked whales. When they dive down to feed, and they vocalize, and so they can track them. The Navy sees what their behavior is. And the Navy found out that when the Navy used the Navy military sonars, which were very loud, they saw that it had an impact on the whales. They would leave the area for a couple of days and then come back. And so we've just recently, over the last few years, done the same experiments with our sonars, and the mapping sonars, we've seen no impact at all from them. So we're very, very pleased to hear that. Even saying that, we still always file permits before we use them. We have procedures of having observers to make sure if we see marine mammals, we'll always shut them off. But we're very well convinced now that the mapping sonars we're using are not having an impact. But it's an important question.
And sound travels a long way under the sea, yeah? Much further than one would expect.
Exactly, and right, and that's why we can use it to map, and that's why we do use it to map, because it'll travel miles and miles and bounce off the seafloor and come back, and we can measure how deep it is.
So did you start this initiative to start mapping the seafloor, or was it going on before you? Or, how did this come to be that we made this decision we were going to start to map the seafloor?
Yeah, I think people have been mapping the seafloor, forever. I mean, there's pictures of an Egyptian papyrus raft taken from a tomb, a little statue in a tomb, and on the front of the raft was an ancient Egyptian with a piece of lead at the end of a rope measuring how deep it was. So I think the initial incentive always for mapping the ocean was safety and navigation. That when a ship runs aground and crashes because you don't know how shallow or deep the ocean is, it's a very bad day for the environment. It's a bad day for the captain. It's a bad day for the economy. 90% of our goods by volume come in by ships still today. And so the initial driver, I think, for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, for mapping the seafloor has been this issue of safety and navigation. Where can a ship safely navigate? And that's still a large driver. Our lab at the University of New Hampshire, a lot of the funding we get is for that purpose, to make sure that we improve maps for safety and navigation. But what's happened more recently is, as we start to recognize how critical the ocean is for our environment, we start looking at ways to use the same techniques, so same mapping techniques, to look at what we call bottom habitat, where certain organisms live and where certain organisms can't live. So that's added to the incentive. The climate story that I told you about, understanding how the currents travel, all these things in the last 40, 50 years have added to the incentive to map the global map. And finally, in about 2017, the Nippon Foundation, which is a large philanthropic foundation in Japan that has a lot of maritime focus, the director of the Nippon Foundation really recognized what a poor state it was. We were getting to the point with computer technology that we were easily able to calculate how much of the seafloor had been mapped. And believe it or not, in 2017 or so, only 6% of the seafloor was mapped at good resolution. We have these satellite ways to make a very broad map. And he basically, using funding from the Nippon Foundation as an incentive, as a facilitator, challenged the community, and I'm part of that community, the mapping community, to see if we can come up with a proposal to try to get the entire world map by 2030. And so a project called Seabed 2030 started in 2017. And I said, from that 6%, we're now up to 20.6% now. And so we've made good progress, but we have a long way
Now,
to go.
when you're mapping, do you see the maps come in real time?
Yes,
So,
yeah, and that's only recently that that's happened. It's only in the last 10 years or so that we've been able to do that. Not only do we see them coming in, we can actually play them in 3D, and that's what's so exciting to watch the seafloor unravel in front of you in 3 dimensions is really really quite
now,
exciting.
do you get surprised by what you see?
Always, always. I've now, this is about my 80th month at sea. I'm
Right.
very old, and I don't think I've ever gone on a trip where I haven't been surprised, particularly because these maps we create now are really high resolution and they're really showing all the details and all the features. And in the old days, we had this idea of the bottom of the seafloor being flat and boring, and it's anything but. And we're just constantly seeing things that surprise us geologically, surprise us biologically. I mean, we just know so little about the ocean that you can't help but be surprised and wondered when you come out here.
What do you see biologically? Because do you see an image of life at the bottom of the ocean, or what do you mean?
Yeah, that's that. Okay, yeah. So our sonars now, when the sonars first started, they only mapped the seafloor, but we now have a new generation of sonars that map the seafloor, but they're also allowing us to look in the water column.
Mm.
One of the great surprises, this happened probably 10 years ago or so, when we first got the ability to look in the water column. Suddenly we were seeing seeps of gas coming out of the bottom all over. The first time we did that, it was very close to the time that Deepwater Horizon exploded. And suddenly our lab and other people who were looking at this technology were all focused on that. And we just really rapidly developed the technology to allow us to look now in 3 dimensions at features in the water column. So we can see schools of fish, we can see schools of plankton. We're starting to see changes in the ocean conditions. We can see temperature and salinity changes in the ocean. We can see even in some places like the Black Sea, there are places where the ocean turns what we call anoxic. It loses all its oxygen. And we can now, with the sonar, map where that happens. And so we're suddenly lifting the veil, basically, and seeing what's inside in 3 dimensions. And it's the seafloor and what's above it and in it too.
In the seafloor, are there like the equivalent of mountains and the peaks and the valleys, and how, when
Huge, huge.
right?
Yeah, some of the seamounts at the bottom of the ocean much larger than Mount Everest. I mean, they're just huge mountains, and some of the valleys, the deep trenches, much larger than the Grand Canyon. These are distributed all around the ocean. We're in an area now around Hawaii. Hawaii itself is one of these seamounts. Hawaii starts at 7,000 meters, so 28, 30,000 feet below, and then comes up the Big Island much higher than Mount Everest. That's 40, 50,000 feet by the time you get from the seafloor to what the top is. Now Hawaii happens to be one that's sticking up above the sea surface. Hawaii is a relatively young island. It's hot because of magma, and there's still volcanoes going off on the Big Island. But as they get older, they cool down and they sink. And so beyond what we see as the Hawaiian island chain, there are many more islands, seamounts, that used to be surface islands, but are now submerged below. There's a chain of islands goes all the way. We call it the Emperor Seamount Chain. Turns around, goes right to Japan, to Hawaii. The whole chain of these submerged seamounts, and in the Pacific there are tens of thousands of these seamounts
When
all
you
over.
see something like the Grand Canyon, which is carved by water, you don't see something down on the bottom that was carved by water and is now filled in, or do you?
Yeah, well, kind of sometimes. There are different types of deep trenches in the ocean. If we go around the areas around Japan and around Alaska, we have the deepest places in the ocean, like the Marianas Trench. This is not a carved canyon like the Grand Canyon. This is the fact that we have two tectonic plates that run into each other, and then one of them goes beneath the other, and it just curls and brings it down. And that's where we get the 34,000 foot depths or so in the Marianas Trench. So that's that way of making a canyon. But if we look at places like the coast of the United States, the Atlantic margin of the United States, that margin, it has a continental shelf that's shallow, kind of 600, 700 feet, and goes out finally to what we call the shelf break. And then the continental slope starts going down. On that shelf break, going down to the deep deep ocean, thousands of meters, are many, many canyons. And those canyons are actually carved very much like the Grand Canyon. Some of them carved when sea level was much lower. 18,000 years ago, we had a sea level was 120. I apologize. I go back and forth. I normally think in meters, and I'm trying to throw out feet for you, but
Yeah.
I'll do it the best I can. Say 360, 400 feet deep. This is how much lower sea level was. And so at that time, rivers like the Hudson River ran all the way out across the continental shelf that was land and carved canyons. And so some of those canyons are like that, but many of the others start in a place that wasn't connected. And what we have underwater are things called turbidity currents. This is where something like an earthquake or some event shakes up the sediment. The sediment gets mixed up, and the sediment in the water form a slurry that's actually a little denser than the surrounding water. And that can go and carve these canyons. And so we have processes under the ocean that carve canyons, much like the Grand Canyon were carved too. So lots of stuff goes on down there, you know.
When you see a dead zone where there's no oxygen, is it a dead zone or is life adapted under there?
Okay, so this is another interesting question. We've always assumed that you need sunlight and oxygen for life. That's the kind of our thought about photosynthesis and stuff like that. And one of the things that we discovered maybe 40 years ago, and Bob Ballard, who's on board now with us here, was one of the early scientists involved with that, was that there are environments in the deep sea with no light access. This is at 10,000 feet. There's no light, yet there's unbelievable populations of organisms growing, and they're supported by what we call, instead of photosynthesis, chemosynthesis. So it's actually hot fluids that are coming up from inside the earth, carrying all kinds of chemicals, and there's special bacteria that have learned to process those chemicals and start a chain of life. And this is, a lot of people think this is, the origin of life really came in these chemosynthetic environments. So there are ways to sustain life. But if you get to some place like the Black Sea, where you starve the ocean of oxygen, there's very, very little that can survive in those kinds of environments. From another perspective, and this is, again, a lot of the work we do on this vessel and the Ocean Exploration Trust is involved with looking at maritime heritage, looking at wrecks. In those anoxic environments, the wrecks are preserved phenomenally well because there's no wood-boring organisms and things like that. So ancient wrecks are preserved beautifully.
Yeah, they just found the one.
Shackleton's Endurance.
Yeah, they just found it and it looked pristine.
And you saw how
right?
beautifully that was preserved. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. You can see whales. They've obviously been in some battle by a giant sea squid. When you're looking at the water column, we don't have many examples of these giant squids. We don't know much about them. Do you see them when you're mapping?
With these water column sonars, we can see individual targets. They don't look like a whale. They don't look like a squid. They look like a blip. And we'll see a blip and we can see it moving, but we don't get a direct view that tells us that's a whale, that's a squid. There are marine biologists or bioacousticians, we call, who can interpret the acoustic return, and probably give you some sense of what the animal is, but certainly not the crowd out here to do that. We do have remotely operated vehicles, and we have several on board today that go down on a cable or sometimes autonomously with high resolution cameras. And there was one dive a couple of years ago, and if you go to the Nautilus Live site from this vessel, they'll have a film clip of this. As the remotely operated vehicle was moving down, it was visited by a whale came swimming by.
Oh, sure, yeah, that's
really quite
amazing.
remarkable.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's amazing. The
A
whale.
remarkable
You
bit
see
of
the
and
whale's eye, like checking out, like, what is this thing down here?
Yep.
Like it has no trouble. It has no trouble being on the surface and then going down. Nothing to the whale. Like, what is this thing
Nope.
down here? Yeah.
What are your thoughts about, people are talking about Mars. I was thinking of a certain billionaire who wants to go to Mars. He could maybe help give you a
Right.
billion to finish the mapping here. What is your thoughts about future life or, here on Earth, people using the ocean? We've talked to, Jesse and I've talked to people on other podcasts about the sort of the floating islands. I mean, how protective do we need to be of our oceans? Where is our pollution problem? Like, how are you thinking about that in terms of, sustenance and also the existential threat to our planet?
Well, the plastics
Yeah,
are a problem, Larry. I mean, what about?
And plastics are a problem for sure. I think we're becoming, again, in the last few years, so much more cognizant of these issues. and understanding the impacts much better. We started in 2021 what's called the Decade of Ocean Science in Support of Sustainable Development. This is a global initiative run out of the UN, but the US is an active member of this. And this is really focused on just those kinds of questions and really taking a global view, and how do we look to the ocean for sustenance but do it in a sustainable way. And so I think that certainly in my lifetime, if there's any time we're going to meet these challenges, we understand, I think for once, how serious the challenges are. We understand enough of the science to know that how careful we have to be, that we can't just kind of run helter-skelter trying things. We really have to be careful about that. And so I'm perpetually an optimist, and I think that science. I look back to the pandemic and look at how when really called upon in a crunch, how the science community came through with vaccines in such an amazingly short period of time. And I just hope that we will get that same level of recognition with respect to the health and state of the ocean soon enough that we can put that kind of effort into it and really get us into a long-term sustainable mode.
Are you optimistic for the future, Larry?
I vacillate back and forth, but I think I have to be. I wouldn't be out here if I wasn't. If I just gave up and said, it's over, I couldn't live with myself. So I am optimistic, but we just have to pay attention. We have, and I sometimes too often I'm preaching to the choir. It really, at the end of the day, becomes a question of how we have our politicians understand how serious this is, and it's a very difficult thing to ask a politician to think in a 20 or 30 or 50-year time frame, as opposed to the next election cycle. And I think and this is the balance I worry about. Will that recognition and enough of the population realize how critical this is come soon enough before we've gone over a tipping point that it's too late? And so I'm still optimistic that we can do that. Don't prove me wrong.
Okay. Do you still get the same excitement when you were 7 and you discovered Jacques Cousteau? When you're out there, do you still feel like, oh my God, and what is that feeling? Is it the infinite is possible? Is it poetic for you? What is the kind of the emotional connection that you have to the ocean?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have to say, I've spent a lot of time at sea, but it's still only a small percentage of my professional career. But I think I've long ago realized that 10 or 15% of the time where you do see something new and do have an exciting discovery, that makes all the rest of the time, all the administrative burdens and dealing with desk problems and things like that, well worthwhile. And I think it is. It's. We were talking about this last night. That I went into this from being inspired by Jacques Cousteau, and it really was from a sense of wanting to explore. I wanted to be an explorer. I grew up in the Bronx in an apartment building, and just nothing like this environment I'm in now. And somehow, that's what the direction I got pushed in. And whenever I see or find something that we hadn't known before, that I realized nobody else has seen, and maybe help people understand new processes and things like that, it's a phenomenally rewarding experience. What we were talking about last night, though, is that the next generation, I had done an interaction with a group of high school students yesterday, and I was just bubbling about how exciting this technology we're building is, because I'm at heart a geek, a nerd, and love the technology. And there seemed to be very little interest on the high school students. They were really interested in ocean acidification and climate change, and how we're working on that. And I realized how right they are, and how lucky we are that that's what's driving them. And so I think the evolution I'm going through now is how I turn this excitement that I have for discovery and exploration and technology, and really put it to what is a greater cause, something that wasn't recognized when I started. So I'm fulfilling my childhood dream, but the next generation of children have a very different dream for a better Earth. And I think we have to start pushing to that. So this is an evolution for me too, in terms of what gets me so excited. So I'm hoping that we'll be making those kinds of contributions too. I can actually show you what's being broadcast right now. I think if I can figure out how to let's see if I do this.
Oh,
That's
wow.
the ship.
Wow. Okay. Amazing.
And this is footage from our last cruise. And you see on the side there is the vehicle, the thing in a gray. That's a launch and
Yeah.
recovery thing, the yellow crane, and there's it being put over the side. This is what we're about to do right now.
Oh,
And then the orange vehicle will pull out from it,
Oh, wow.
And then it
Oh,
goes
yeah,
off
yeah.
on its own on pre-programmed missions.
Amazing.
Amazing.
And if I go look at if I go to the deck view now, let's see, 7. I'll try to see, I'll hit
Wow.
buttons, we'll see what happens. That's our sonar being lowered.
Oh, wow.
And I'll just let you, I'll run through this little loop and so you get a few, so that's
Wow.
the sonar
Wow.
again
Man,
beneath the surface. And here it should pull out of the vehicle, out of the launch recovery thing. And then we'll take that gray thing back on the ship and then the vehicle can stay out 7 days if it has to.
it's
We've
just
never run
like
it that long. We're
here-
just starting with it.
This is
Yeah.
definitely like going up on this, up to space.
Oh yeah, a lot of the technical challenges are a lot harder in the ocean than they are in space.
Hmm.
Space is a much less harsh environment.
Wow, this is beautiful. Great
Yeah.
quality.
And then the videographer on board here is really talented.
Yeah.
So there it is. You can see that this is one of the real beauties of this system is how fast this vehicle
Yeah.
can go. So it
Yeah.
can keep up with the mothership, so to speak. And and at some point we want to get to the point where it will kill me because I love being at sea, but where we don't have to go to sea. We just
Right.
launch these from shore and let them go off and do the mapping.
Yeah.
Could always
I think
hang out.
I think you'll see a big fish swim by there. Yes,
Right.
here's the real beauty shot of the thing.
So it'll ping and then the ship will pick up what the difference between the two.
Yeah, so it has all kinds of, we're connecting either, depending how far away it is, we connect to the ship either by Wi-Fi, if it's close enough, if it's further distance by what we call a broadband radio, that'd be
Mhm.
about 20 kilometers. And then after that, we can talk to it by satellite, although
Oh,
by
wow.
satellite, we get less information. And here it comes back and it tries to automatically dock itself back into the recovery system.
Right.
And so that's that. And if I go live now onto the deck, let's see if I do this.
Now,
if I
how
do that,
tame do
yeah,
the
so
seas,
that's,
how tame do the seas have to be able to do that?
yeah,
Larry?
that's a good question. Yeah, well, that's what we're learning. The launch, we can get away with a relatively rough sea. When the vehicle's in, it doesn't care. It's what we call wave piercing. It can, it's the recovery that's really tricky. And we had some exciting moments, because what happens every afternoon here, the winds come up. So I think are you seeing the
Yeah.
deck now?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So you see people climbing up on a ladder. We're about to start launching it. The orange vehicle on the right is a Woods Hole autonomous underwater vehicle, and the yellow one, the little yellow one back there where the person is walking, that's a different type of vehicle that's meant to go around in the middle of the water column, travel, to follow plankton and things
Right.
like that.
Wait, is this one
So
from
we're-
This one's from I grew up there in Woods Hole.
The orange one is from Hui, the
Yep.
yellow one is from Hui, and the orange one on your right, but the big one, the Drix, the surface vehicle, that's from the University of New Hampshire.
Got it.
That's ours.
Okay.
Doesn't it have to be pretty quick to follow plankton?
No,
No?
it has to be very slow. The
Oh.
plankton just, for the most part, just drift.
Okay.
They're just drifting, so it only goes 1 or 2 knots.
Okay.
Um,
Interesting.
That's its key, is going slow.
Mhm.
Yeah, and we actually have to, because we have had to train our vehicle to how to follow something so slow, because our vehicle likes to go fast. So what we do is we run on top of the vehicle, we run circles.
Mm.
We just run loop, because we don't like to go slow.
Now, autonomous
went
vehicles,
fast.
do you ever get worried that they don't know where they are and you can't recover it?
I worry every minute about it.
Right.
But so far we've gotten it back.
Oh,
So,
good.
but I'm always worried about it. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Well, it certainly
We have
sounds.
lots of redundancy, lots of backup systems.
Yeah.
So we have radios, we have Wi-Fi. The worst case, we have an Iridium phone on it. If it really gets lost, it calls home. And
Nice.
says, I'm alive, at least. I'm here.
Well, hopefully you don't have to use that,
Yes, yeah, that's the hope.
Yeah. How many people are on that ship, Larry?
Probably about 40 something. There's a crew of 17 and the rest are scientists
Yeah.
and from many different institutions, Woods Hole, UNH, Applied Physics Lab, the Ocean Exploration Trust that runs the ship. They have a number of people here, and Ballard is with us on this trip, and some colleagues of his.
Why do you need the physicists?
Everything is physics.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, everything is physics. How sound travels in the ocean
Mm.
is physics. How light travels in the air.
Mm.
I mean, to be honest, some of the best engineers and scientists really started with a physics background because
Yeah.
they understand all the goings on in the world around them.
You know, that group of people, though, even if they're from different institutions, they
Okay,
must all know each other. You got to go?
Well, I guess they're doing it without me. So,
Well, if you gotta
Oh
go,
no,
be
no,
it.
go. We'll catch
No,
it.
no, I can't interrupt it now. I just turned it on. You can see it's being put over the side right
Oh,
now.
wow.
So I can't interrupt it now. This is, I'm supposed to be handling one of those lines. So,
Ah,
Oh no. Uh-oh.
geez, I hope they don't mess
it's
it
great.
up, Larry.
They'll probably do it better without me.
Ah.
So you see that you can see this thing going out now.
Mhm, yeah.
I always get, this is not as nervous as bringing it back in, but
Yeah.
I'll keep this on so you can watch and you'll see it slip over the side. Yeah.
Do you want to run out there,
So,
Larry, and we let you go? 'Cause
No,
we-
no, I don't. No, right now it would be too dangerous for me to run out there.
Oh, okay.
I need a hard hat and all that kind of stuff. I do have my steel-toed shoes on though.
We don't want to get you in trouble.
No. It's okay.
But you
I
can
mean,
tell
I think
everybody
I'm-
that
I'm-
this will be broadcast, and our podcast is a visual podcast, so
Yeah.
people can watch this.
Okay, and yeah, so let's wait at least till it separates it in a few, well,
Yeah.
hopefully in a minute or so. The vehicle will separate out. We'll see it move back, and at that point I can go outside.
Yeah.
I'll help them recover it back on. Let's see if I can do this here. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
there we go.
Wow.
Do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay. So there it is over in the water here.
Wow.
So I'm supposedly handling those two blue lines up front. I wonder who's doing it.
Yeah.
They're doing very well.
Yeah.
We'll see in a second or so, hopefully if all, or maybe, I don't know how long, they're going through some checks, pre-launch checks. We'll see the orange vehicle, the Drix itself, should back itself out of that gray thing.
Yeah.
Mm.
And then the gray thing the gray thing is just for launching and recovering. We call it the Universal Delivery System.
Right.
And then the gray apparatus comes back on the ship.
It'll come back on and then we'll spend the rest of the day with the Drix outside mapping or doing whatever it's doing. And then when it's time to recover it, we'll put the gray thing back over and hopefully Drix will automatically go into it and then we bring it back safely. That's always the plan.
Now, will industry use those
Okay,
maps?
the Drix, you see the Drix,
It's
is it's
Yeah.
pulling
That's
out.
so
now.
cool. This is like Cape Canaveral, but not. We're in Hawaii.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Super cool.
So what's it gonna do now? Is it listening? What's this ship gonna do?
Oh yeah, we're talking. Well, the ship can go off and do whatever it wants now. That's
Yeah.
the neat thing. That's the whole point of this.
Yeah.
So we're going to send it on a mapping mission nearby here, and the ship can do other things, and that's part of increasing this efficiency. That we now have these robots that can go off and do things. Otherwise, the ship at $50,000-$60,000 a day would have to be focused on just one task,
Right.
and so that's part of what we're trying to develop here.
Well, Larry, thank you so much for coming on and telling us a little bit about what you're doing. Really appreciate it very much.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I thank you for the opportunity.
And also, where can we see the draw? How can we follow along? Is there like a URL?
Okay, yeah. Yes, if you go to just Nautilus, NAUTILUS, nautiluslive.org, I think it is. Okay, and so you see. Well, let's see. Let me go in here, and so let's see if I do that.
Oh,
So
wow.
so now we're in. This is what's right behind me. You can see
Yeah.
I'm in a studio
Mhm.
with the control van right here. So our team is sitting here with the pilot and the navigators, and they're getting a bunch of views up on the top. You can see
Mhm.
above the pilot's head, there's a bunch of cameras. So there are cameras on that Drix. So it's giving it some situational awareness. The large blue screen below is actually a map, and they can see the position of the ship, the
Mhm.
position of the vehicle, and anything else we have there. And there's all the mapping information we have. And as we start collecting mapping data, the depths will be painted out on there
Oh,
too.
wow. Amazing.
Incredible.
Amazing. Yeah.
This
Yeah.
was fun.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Larry, very much.
It's really great.
Okay, now, all right. Well, it's a pleasure talking to you. Now I'll go and apologize.
Okay.
Blame us.
Sorry for making you late, Larry.
I'll blame you guys for
Okay.
sure.
We'll
Okay.
take the blame.
All right, have
We'll
fun.
take the heat.
Bye,
Thank
guys.
Okay.
you so much. It was a blast.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
What a blast that was.
Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff. Shows you how small the world is.
Well, no, actually, how large it is and how little we know about it.
Okay, well, there you go.
All right, see you later.
Okay, bye.